My brother made my life hell, then got my wife pregnant. Now he wants my help. After our parents disowned him and left me their $2 million inheritance, I found out that my younger brother David has always been harboring a deep, he's always resented me, but that's not why. He was the favored child, not me. There was no reason for him to be jealous. To give you some context, our mom always indulged David. She was the golden child of our family. She cooked his meals, did his laundry and even asked me to help him with his schoolwork. I was expected to assist him simply because he was my brother. Because we were family. But I never got the same treatment. I put up with it because I was quite independent. Maybe it was partly my fault for always meeting his needs without expecting anything in return. He never helped me when I needed it and only approached me when he wanted something. While I was a quiet, introverted kid who enjoyed studying and keeping to myself, he was loud and rough, just like our dad. I am usually straightforward and honest, never sugarcoating things. I think my mom may have developed a negative perception of me because of my straightforwardness. This favoritism made David the family's darling, and I didn't mind it while we were growing up. However, problems began when he started bullying and mocking me for being. He teased me about being different from him, about my height and the fact that I wore glasses. He even used to sneak into my room and read my diary, and then he'd complain to my mom about what I'd written. When I'd yell at him and complain to our parents about him invading my privacy, they'd laugh and say it wasn't a big deal. He did more awful things, too, like nearly breaking my glasses and putting. He did some awful things, like breaking my glasses and putting nasty stuff in my food. He even put stones in my cereal once, but luckily I found them before they could damage my teeth. When I told my mom, she dismissed it, saying, "This is how brothers bond." Whenever we fought, David would focus on my insecurities to insult me. We went to the same school, so he knew I was being bullied by a few kids. Instead of supporting me, he was always siding with the bullies, calling me names like ugly loser and hairy monkey, and even encouraging them to physically harm me, saying I was just a big failure. Another time, during a fight over something really trivial that I can't even remember now, he actually told me to kill myself. While I could easily brush off most insults, some really hurt because I was struggling with my mental health at the time. I'm doing better now, but it was devastating to hear that my own brother wanted me dead. Since Dad was often at work and Mum didn't seem to care much, she even scolded me once, claiming it was my fault for irritating him. Things progressively worsened during high school. There was a shocking incident when David attempted to set my hair on fire, and unbelievably, our mother defended him. He said he was just playing, but who says that? Thankfully, my dad eventually sided with me and pointed out how serious it was. He even threatened to call the police on David. This was a real eye-opener for my brother, as he had never faced any consequences for his actions before. He was genuinely stunned, and my dad made it clear that enough was enough. Enough was enough, and that David needed to start respecting his older brother. Later, Dad came into my room to talk. I never expected his support because he always told David how similar they were, which was true. Dad admitted that he had waited years for David to mature, but he was slowly realizing that David was becoming a big bully. Hearing this from my dad was incredibly shocking. It was validating, and I almost broke down in tears. I confessed everything David had done to me over the years, even the bullying at school. My dad was shocked at how much I had endured. The next day, he spoke to the principal to ensure the bullies were warned about severe consequences if they continued. Later that evening, Dad enrolled me in MMA at our local gym, telling me I needed to toughen up and stand up to bullies. I admit that a nerdy kid like me trying to learn to fight might have seemed laughable, but I was very focused. I managed my time well to balance my studies and daily workouts, and the MMA classes completely changed my life. One day, David was up to his antics again. He stole my pocket money, which we received for. I was trying to be a better role model for David, who seemed to enjoy seeing me scolded. I was a nerdy kid, but I was very focused. I managed my time well to balance my studies and daily workouts, and the MMA classes completely changed my life in terms of my physique. One day, David was up to his antics again. He stole my pocket money, which I had been saving for a while. David sneaked into my room and took it. I caught him just as he was about to cycle off with his friends. I demanded he return my money, but David said all he could do was run to Daddy for help. I don't know what came over me, but I punched him in the face. He was stunned, fell backward, and I retrieved my money from his pocket. Before throwing him back down, David started crying loudly, which was quite comical. However, my mother rushed out to help him and find out what happened. When she learned I had fought him, she was surprised and reprimanded me, saying I should be a better role model for David, who seemed to enjoy seeing me scolded. My mother also complained to my dad about my behavior, saying I needed before throwing him back down. David started crying loudly, which was pretty funny. However, my mother rushed out to help him and find out what happened. When she learned I had fought him, she was surprised and told me off, saying I should be a better role model for David, who seemed to enjoy seeing me scolded. My mother also complained to my dad about my behavior, saying I needed to be controlled. My dad asked us both to explain ourselves. I told him how David had stolen the money I had worked hard for and saved, while David tried to justify it by saying he needed the money for a date and that, as his brother, I should help him. However, Dad told David he was lucky I only punched him for stealing because anyone else would have called the police. He told David that he shouldn't take other people's things without asking. David didn't like that and threw a tantrum, probably hoping our mom would side with him, but Dad was firm. When David realized he wasn't going to be punished for being hit, he screamed how much he hated me and ran back to his room, locking himself in. After that, he started to keep his distance from me. He'd finally understood that he couldn't bully me anymore and that even Dad had stopped supporting his behavior for the first time in ages. I felt like we were equals, but he could still insult me. When our parents weren't around, he'd get angrier and more short-tempered. He was getting angrier and more short-tempered every year. If I asked him something, he'd ignore me and walk away, muttering insults like nerd or loser under his breath. If he needed to talk to me, he'd go to our mom instead of talking to me. When I asked her about it, she'd tell me to be more understanding. I couldn't tell if it was just puberty or if he really hated me. Over time, dealing with his comments became unbearable, and I really wanted to move out and get away from him. I asked my mom to. She always refused to mediate a sit-down conversation to resolve our issues, saying she didn't want to get involved. When I asked her opinion on why David treated me this way, she would brush off the question. Eventually, I left for my dream university, having earned a scholarship as a top student. My dad threw a party for me, and even my mom seemed proud. However, David remained aloof and distant, barely acknowledging my achievements. The day I left for university was a mix of excitement for the future and relief to escape the toxic home environment. The first few months at university were great. I made new friends, enjoyed my classes and started to build a life separate from the horrible atmosphere of my childhood. I wasn't as afraid of David's verbal attacks anymore, which made me feel much more relaxed. During my second year, I met my wife Karen at a frat party through a friend, and we got on really well. We were from religious backgrounds, so having kids outside of marriage wasn't something we were keen on. However, when we found out she was pregnant in our final year, we decided to get married right after graduation. The wedding was a small but happy ceremony. Our parents were happy for us and we enjoyed the celebration. At that moment, I thought Karen was the love of my life. I had always thought a monogamous relationship was what I wanted, one woman to come home to and share my life with. Despite other women showing interest over the years, I never pursued anything because I was genuinely content in my marriage. Karen was my dream girl and I never wanted to hurt her. However, I later found out about 2 incidents of infidelity in our marriage. One was an intermittent affair with her married co. The first was a long-term job, and the second was a short-term thing with an ex-boyfriend during a visit to her family. Some might think I was naive, and looking back, I can't completely disagree. Each time we separated for a while, I chose to forgive my wife. I didn't want to raise our child in a broken home, and I believed we could overcome these obstacles. The affair with her coworker happened when we were young, and I put it down to youthful mistakes and poor judgment. For a while, things seemed to get better, although I could never fully trust her again, but I did my best to set aside my doubts, knowing that if I chose to forgive, I had to genuinely work toward a fresh start. It's been 4 years since her second betrayal, and I felt confident in my decision to give her another chance. Karen seemed to have changed, and we were genuinely happy, planning our family's future. However, 3 months ago, my world was shattered once more when she revealed that she had been having a long-term relationship. Term affair, and suggested that our son might not be mine. Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. A mix of shock, betrayal, and disbelief overwhelmed me. I struggled to comprehend the enormity of her confession. Over the next few days, I managed to ask why she had kept such a significant secret and how she could have done. I asked her why she'd kept it secret and how she could have done it, but she just gave me this cold, indifferent response, like she was detached from the pain she caused. She gave me some vague answers that left me with more questions than answers. It was a surreal and painful moment, and I was confronted with the shattered trust and uncertainty about my own family. I kept on pressing Karen for the truth. I felt I deserved to know the father of the child I'd been raising since birth. In the end, she admitted it was David. My eyes opened really wide as I asked Karen what she meant. She explained that she and David had become friends when I introduced her to my family, and she'd stayed with us from Thanksgiving until New Year. David was usually nice to her, which made me happy because I didn't want Karen to feel unwelcome. Karen wanted to be accepted into my family, so she spent a lot of time with my mom whenever she could. She noticed the tension between David and me and asked me about it. I told her about our rocky relationship and explained that we might never get back to where we were before. Karen understood, but started including David in our outings, hoping it would help us bond. Whenever we planned to watch a movie, she invited David, and we watched whatever he chose. During this time, David and I exchanged a few. Karen and I had a pretty rocky relationship, and she mentioned that we might never be able to get past our issues. She tried to get David involved, hoping it would help us bond. She'd invite him to watch movies with us, and we'd just hang out. It was a bit of an improvement from his usual silent treatment. I remember Karen and David hanging out and playing video games, but I never thought much of it. Then one day, David opened up to her about his struggles from a recent breakup. Feeling vulnerable, he struck up a friendship with her. She said he would flirt with her when I wasn't there, and things got a bit out of hand. The idea of my wife and brother sleeping together didn't sit well with me. Karen said she felt guilty afterwards and left him, which was the same as her sudden decision to go home instead of spending the night. New Year's with me, but I tried to convince her to stay. She was adamant about leaving. When we met back at college after the holidays, she was her usual cheerful self, so I didn't question anything. 2 weeks later, we found out she was pregnant. Karen admitted she didn't know if the child was mine or David's, and with no way to prove it, she chose to stay with me, knowing I was the more dependable brother. This was why we got married. My world felt like it was crashing down. The son I loved might not even be mine. I asked Karen if she had been sleeping with David recently, and she slowly nodded. She revealed that they had always stayed in touch. Because they had undeniable chemistry, they would sneak off to hotels, lying to me about working overtime. She admitted that half of her business trips were actually romantic getaways with him. I asked why she married me if she wanted my brother, and she said she didn't want to be the one to break off the marriage. She saw me as a great father to our son and decided to stay. She said she'd made a mistake and didn't know when to stop. I told Karen I was glad she told me the truth, but that I was going to pack up and leave. She started crying, asking for forgiveness, and expected me to yell at her instead. I calmly packed my stuff. Karen, she insisted that if I loved her, I should fight for her, and that mistakes happen in every marriage. When she realized I wasn't going to do anything, she changed tactics, saying our son would be affected by a divorce and that children shouldn't be raised in broken homes. I reminded her that I might not even be the father, and this made her cry more and accuse me of being cruel. It seemed like she didn't think I'd ever want to leave the marriage. Maybe it was partly my fault for not dealing with things properly in the past. While I did love her, it felt more like it came from thinking we had a son together and had been together since college. Karen, she kept on saying it wasn't too late to sort things out, but I had trouble believing her and I'd reached the end of my tether. Trust was a big issue and what she said felt empty. I could forgive her, but I'd never forget that she slept with my brother. I've always thought it's important to forgive mistakes because we're all human, but this was just unacceptable. I left her crying on the doorstep and checked into a hotel the next day. I went straight to my parents and revealed everything about my wife's affair with David, explaining how they had been secretly sleeping together for years. The shock on their faces was undeniable. True to her nature, my mother initially tried. I left her crying on the doorstep and checked into a hotel the next day. I went straight to my parents and spilled the beans about my wife's affair with David, explaining how they had been secretly sleeping together for years. The shock on their faces was clear for all to see. True to her nature, my mother initially tried to defend David, insisting that her boy could never do such a thing to his own brother. Determined to expose the truth, I asked my parents to keep quiet and let me call David in front of them. I instructed them to stay quiet so I could catch David off guard, making him believe it was a private conversation. I told my parents to keep quiet and let me call David in front of them. I told them to stay quiet so David wouldn't suspect anything was up when he answered the phone. I confronted him about the affair. At first, he denied it and wouldn't take any responsibility. But when I told him that Karen had admitted to everything, he started blaming her, saying she had no character. He claimed it wasn't his fault if women were attracted to him and that he was the better man. He answered the phone and told him about the affair. At first, he said it wasn't true and wouldn't take any responsibility. But when I told him that Karen had admitted to everything, he started blaming her, saying she had no character. He said it wasn't his fault if women were attracted to him and that he was the better brother. I told him firmly that I would tell everyone. David laughed and said no one would believe me because I was just a nobody. I laughed at his arrogance and thanked him for confirming the truth. I knew our parents had heard everything. David went quiet and then spluttered, trying to explain himself and salvage his image. My mother, still in shock, demanded an explanation from David. He stuttered through a feeble attempt to justify his actions, blaming everyone else but himself and desperately trying to shift the blame onto Karen. I could see my mother, who had once been protective of her favored son, now feel a mix of disappointment and anger in that charged moment. My mum was shocked and asked David what he'd done. He tried to explain, but he was really nervous and kept blaming other people. He tried to make it seem like it was Karen's fault. I could see that my mum, who used to be nice to him, was now really disappointed and angry. I felt kind of happy, because for years I had to put up with David being mean to me, and now the tables had turned. David was the one who had done something wrong. He couldn't even talk properly. My dad, who doesn't usually say much, was really disappointed. He asked me to get him the phone and started to speak. I felt a bit strange, but also kind of vindicated, knowing that David had been the one doing all the bad stuff for years. Now the truth was out and the roles were reversed. David was the one who had done wrong, and everyone could see that. As David started to stumble over his words, my dad, who's usually pretty reserved, couldn't hide his disappointment. He asked me to pass him the phone and started to speak. To David. David, my dad said, his voice sounding disappointed. What you did was a betrayal of your brother, but also of this family. You slept with your brother's wife and kept up the affair even after they got married. What you did has severe consequences and has totally shattered the trust we had in you. I raised you both to value family loyalty and decency, but you've shown today that you don't. He paused, thinking about what he'd said, and David felt bad. He didn't respect his brother's marriage and he hurt him. You need to value family loyalty and decency. What you've shown today goes against everything I've tried to teach you. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink into David's conscience. You don't care about your brother's feelings and you don't respect his marriage. You've hurt him and torn apart the bonds that hold our family. Your mother and I are partly to blame for what you've become, but we won't tolerate this behavior from you anymore. From today, you're cut off from the college funds I set up for you. You'll have to figure out how to pay your university fees on your own. I won't be funding your lifestyle anymore. Do you think sleeping with a married woman makes you more of a man? Women, let's see how you manage without my money. I kept calm, but I wanted to scream at David. Watching my dad punish him was the icing on the cake. I had exposed his true nature, and it was clear he had underestimated the consequences. My mother, despite David's persistent protests, continued to. But my dad quickly ended the call, cutting off David's attempts to explain. Afterwards, my mum came over and gave me a hug. It had been ages since we'd shared a moment like that, but there was a silent understanding and support in that hug. She said sorry for not believing me for so long, your old son. My dad quickly ended the call, putting an end to David's attempts to explain his actions afterwards. My mum came over to hug me. It had been ages since we'd shared a moment like that, but in that hug there was an unspoken understanding and support amid the family turmoil. She apologized for not believing me all this time. My 14-year-old self could never have imagined this moment, being vindicated and embraced by my mum. After this, my dad helped me find a good lawyer to get a divorce from Karen. She and her lawyer tried to fight dirty, asking for alimony since I earned more than her, but her affair played heavily in my favor. We also did a paternity test and it was confirmed that David was indeed the father of the child. The news was incredibly painful, even worse than discovering Karen's infidelity. I was furious that the son I had loved and raised it wasn't mine, but I decided to keep going. Karen begged me to keep visiting my son, saying he shouldn't be punished for the situation, but I couldn't bear to see him. He reminded me too much of David, and I hated it. After my divorce was finalized, I felt a sense of freedom wash over me as I moved into my own bachelor pad. It felt surreal to live alone, since I had married so young and never really had the chance to experience independence. However, my naturally independent nature allowed me to quickly adapt to my new. I really enjoyed the lifestyle, and 2 weeks ago my dad called to tell me he was thinking of changing his will because he didn't want to leave anything to David. My dad's incredibly stubborn, and once he decided to cut David out of his life, he stuck to it. David tried reaching out to our parents and even showed up at their doorstep begging for forgiveness, but they refused to let him in. Even my mother, who usually gives in to David's tantrums, seemed done with him. It must have been hardest for her, though. David never. He texted me to say sorry for what he'd done, showing he didn't regret his actions. He was just upset about being cut off from our parents. Our dad told me he planned to leave everything to me, making sure David wouldn't try to claim it later. He'd leave David only $1. I couldn't believe it, as our dad had worked hard his entire life, including his assets, retirement fund and life insurance. The total came to nearly $2 million. The only condition in his will was that if our dad passed away before my mum, she'd still live in their house, but it would be mine. I didn't mind, as I wanted to look after my mum in her final days. David found out, and, not being able to reach our parents, called me yesterday trying to make amends. He explained how he was struggling with college and that, after Karen found out about the baby, she'd been pestering him for child support. He said he was broke and was looking for part. Before my mum passed away, she carried on living in their house even though the ownership was going to transfer to me. Didn't mind this as I wanted to look after my mum in her final days. David found out about this and, unable to reach our parents, called me yesterday trying to make amends. He explained how he was struggling with college and that after Karen discovered the paternity of the child, she had been pestering him for child support. He said he had no money and was looking for part-time jobs but couldn't find anything. He begged me to talk to our family to start fresh, since he really needed my help. I laughed in his face and told him I was done with him. I reminded him that he should have thought about the consequences before sleeping with my wife and getting her pregnant. David argued that I was being unfair and that Karen was also to blame, to which I agreed. I reminded him that I had divorced her, making her his responsibility now, and he shouldn't be. He tried to get me to talk to the family to start fresh, saying he really needed my help, but I just laughed and told him I was done with him. I reminded him that he should have thought about the consequences before sleeping with my wife and getting her pregnant. David said I was being unfair and that Karen was also to blame, which I agreed with. I told him that I'd divorced her, so she was his responsibility now, and he shouldn't be calling me to complain about her or the child, since these were the consequences of his own actions. David started to raise his voice, but I interrupted, reminding him that he was no longer the favored child in the family, but the black sheep who'd slept with his own brother's wife. At that moment, David began to cry, telling me how everyone, including our grandparents and relatives, had turned against him. While this was true, it was no longer my concern, so I told him we were done. He started to raise his voice, but I interrupted and told him that he wasn't the favored child in the family anymore, but the black sheep who had slept with his own brother's wife. He then started crying and told me how everyone, including our grandparents and relatives, had turned against him. I told him that we were done and that he should never call me again, since I no longer considered him my brother. Since then, I've replayed the conversation in my mind. Despite my hatred for my brother, I had never heard him cry, at least not since we were kids. I won't lie, it did hurt me a bit to see him so helpless. So, I guess I'm here to ask if I should talk to our parents about him, or if I would be. If I don't, hi everyone. Many of you have been asking why I am no longer in contact with. Some people have even called me cruel, but I need to explain that I'm not comfortable raising another man's child. This isn't a stepson situation. I was led to believe Henry was my son, only to later discover he is actually my brother David's son. Needless to say, this revelation hurt deeply and I cried over it for days. The main reason I don't want any contact with Henry is that I no longer want Karen in my life. If I remain connected to her child, she will find a way to my life's all about me, and I need my space. You might think I'm a bit cruel or selfish, but I can't see him ever again, at least not for a while. Update: most of you guessed right that it was my mum who told David about my dad changing his will, which made David call me to try and sort things out. I confronted her in front of my dad and she had a proper cry, saying I had punished David enough and that he had learned his lesson. My dad told my mother that if she believed what David did was forgivable, then he could no longer stay married to her because he could never forgive such a betrayal. This silenced my mother. My dad made it clear that if she ever my dad and she had a proper old chat, saying I'd punished David enough and that he'd learned his lesson. My dad told my mother straight if she thought what David did was forgivable, then he could never be with her again because he could never forgive such a betrayal. This shut her up. My dad made it clear that if she ever talked to David again, we'd have to go our separate ways. As I said, my dad's very stubborn. Hopefully my mother will learn from her mistakes. Update: it's been 5 months since my last update. My relationship with my parents has improved over the past few months. My dad and I go golfing every weekend. He treats me more like a buddy than a son, but my mum misses David. She stayed away from him. The last I heard about David was from my cousin, who said he'd been asking everyone for money and eventually had to drop out of college because he couldn't afford the fees. He and Karen are living together and he has a part-time job. He's more like a mate to me than a son, even though my mum still misses David. The last I heard about him was from my cousin, who said he'd been asking everyone for money and eventually had to drop out of college because he couldn't afford the fees. He's got a part-time job as a mechanic, apparently. They're raising Henry together, which is good, I guess. I never talk to my parents about David, and they don't bring him up either. Everyone's asking, so I'll just come straight to the point. I was promoted at my job 2 months ago, so my salary's gone up a lot. I haven't been dating anyone, as I feel like I still need time and space to heal. I've been going to therapy, so we'll see how that works out. Thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you.